My older brother betrayed my other brother with his fiancée. He destroyed our entire family for an affair. But years later, life taught him a lesson he'll never forget, and when he begged for help, we all turned our backs. I'm 22 years old, work in administration at a small office. And honestly, I need to write this out because what happened in my family basically destroyed all of us. And every time I think about it, my blood boils. But I also feel this kind of dark satisfaction about how it all ended, you know, because in the end, life has strange ways of delivering justice. We grew up as 4 siblings, well, 3 brothers and me, and my parents always drilled into our heads that family was the most important thing in the world, like blood is thicker than water, and all those phrases that make you feel like you have this unbreakable bond with your family, that no matter what happens, you always have to be there for your siblings, that family loyalty is sacred, and all that. My dad repeated it constantly, especially during family dinners or when any of us fought with another. He'd tell us that friends come and go, but family is forever. And we believed him. I mean, we really believed him for years. Nick was the oldest. He was 29 when all this happened, and he was always like the golden child of the family. You know, that type of person who everything works out for. Super charismatic, with an amazing job in finance, made a ton of money, always had funny stories to tell, and my parents basically adored him, like he could do whatever he wanted and they'd always justify it. Then there was Sam. He was 25, and he was completely different from Nick, quieter, more thoughtful. He worked in construction, and didn't make as much as Nick. But he was one of those people who work hard for everything they have. Nothing was ever handed to him. And honestly, he was always my favorite brother because he was genuine, you know? He wasn't going around showing off or trying to be the center of attention all the time. Lily was 26 and was the most level-headed of all of us, super practical, worked as a nurse, and was basically the voice of reason in the family. When there was family drama, she was the one who could see things clearly without getting carried away by emotions, though that changed after what happened, but I'll get to that. The thing is, we were always a close family. Like we had Sunday dinners at my parents' house without fail. We celebrated all birthdays together. We messaged each other in the family group chat every day. And I was like everyone's confidant because being the youngest, I guess everyone felt like they could talk to me without being judged. So I knew things about each person that the others didn't know. And that made me feel special, but also put me in a horrible position when everything exploded. Sam met Heather like 5 years ago. You think, time gets a bit confusing for me. She was 21 at the time and Sam was 20, and they met at a mutual friend's party or something like that. I don't remember the exact details, but I do remember Sam was super excited, like I'd never seen him like that with any girl. And Heather seemed really sweet at first. She was pretty, funny, seemed genuinely interested in him, and we all welcomed her with open arms because Sam was happy and that's what mattered. They dated for 2 years before Sam proposed, and he was the first of all of us to get engaged, which was a big deal because in my family that meant you were really sure about the person. My parents had been married for like 35 years at that point and had always told us that marriage was sacred and that you didn't get married unless you were absolutely certain. The proposal was really sweet. Sam took her to this lake where they'd gone on their first date, had photos and everything planned. And Heather said, yes, obviously, and we were all happy for them. We had this huge family dinner to celebrate, and Nick gave this super emotional toast about how Sam had found his person and how proud he was of his younger brother, and I remember thinking in that moment that it was the most beautiful speech I'd ever heard. But looking back, it makes me want to throw up when I think about it, because how can you say those things and then do what he did? They started planning the wedding, and Heather was super into all the details, like choosing colors and looking at venues and tasting cakes, and Sam was happy to let her make all those decisions, because he wasn't the type of person who stressed about those details. He trusted her completely. The whole family was involved somehow. Mom helped Heather with decisions. Lily went with her to look at dresses. Nick offered advice about the budget because he had experience with finances. And I was basically there to support Sam emotionally, because even though he was happy, he was also nervous. You know, it's a big step. But then I started noticing weird things, like little details that at first I ignored because I thought I was being paranoid or that my brain was making things up where there weren't any. Heather and Nick started having like these inside jokes that nobody else understood. They'd laugh together at things, and when someone asked what it was about, they'd say, "Oh, nothing. It's silly." and they'd look at each other in a way that made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't explain exactly why. At family gatherings, Heather always sat near Nick. Like, even if Sam was on the other side of the room, she'd find a way to end up next to Nick. And he always gave her all his attention, asked her about the wedding, about her work, about anything, and I thought, well, maybe they just get along, maybe he's trying to be a good brother-in-law. But there was something about the way they looked at each other that didn't feel normal. You know what I mean? Sam also started noticing it after a while, like 3 or 4 months before the wedding they had planned, and one night he called me and said, "Hey, have you noticed anything weird between Heather and Nick?" And I went quiet because I didn't know whether to tell him yes, that I had noticed something, or if I'd sound like an idiot making drama out of nothing. I told him maybe I noticed they spent time together, but it probably wasn't anything. That Nick was just being friendly, but Sam told me he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. That Heather had been distant with him lately, that when he got home she'd be on her phone and put it away quickly, that he'd found messages on her computer that she'd deleted, but he managed to see part of one where she mentioned missing someone. And I felt like a bucket of cold water had been thrown on me because in that moment I knew my suspicions weren't crazy, that something was really happening. I told him he had to talk to her, that he had to confront her and ask her directly. But Sam told me he was scared, that if he was wrong he'd seem like a jealous and controlling boyfriend, and if he was right he didn't know if he could handle the answer. So he decided to wait, which I understand, but it was also the worst decision because things only got worse. 2 weeks later, Sam showed up at my apartment around 11 at night. He was crying and could barely speak, and I had never seen my brother cry like that. Not even when he broke his arm when we were like 12 and 15. And he told me Heather had confessed everything, that she'd been having an affair with Nick for the past 6 months, that it started when Nick offered to help her with something for the wedding. You don't remember what exactly. I think it was about the budget or something, and they ended up spending time alone. And one thing led to another, and basically they'd been sleeping together for half a year while Sam planned to marry her, while the whole family supported them, while Nick gave speeches about family loyalty and how proud he was of his brother. Sam told me that Heather said she'd fallen in love with Nick, that it wasn't her intention but it happened, and that she couldn't marry Sam when her feelings were with someone else. And the part that made me sickest was when Sam told me Heather acted like she was the victim. In all this, like she'd been so brave to confess the truth instead of recognizing that she'd destroyed my brother. What happened next was like watching an accident in slow motion, like you know it's going to be horrible but you can't look away. Heather packed her things and left the apartment with Sam, and 2 days later we found out she'd moved in with Nick, that Nick basically welcomed her with open arms as if he hadn't just betrayed his own brother in the worst possible way. I called Nick because I needed to hear his side. I needed to understand how he could do something like this. And when I confronted him, he told me it wasn't his fault, that love is complicated, that you can't control who you fall in love with, and that Sam would eventually get over it. And I yelled at him over the phone because, seriously, that was his argument? That love is complicated? I told him he was a piece of garbage, that he'd destroyed Sam, that he'd destroyed the family, and he just told me I was too young to understand these things, that someday I'd get it. And I hung up because I literally couldn't keep talking to him without wanting to break something. The family split immediately, and it was brutal. Like Dad, when he found out, basically said Nick was dead to him, that he didn't want to see him again, that he didn't consider him his son after what he'd done. And Mom at first was also angry, but then started with this thing about how Nick was still her son, that the family had to stay together, that we all make mistakes. And Dad and her started fighting constantly about it because Dad said what Nick did wasn't a mistake, it was a deliberate betrayal. And Mom insisted that eventually we all had to forgive and move on. Lily was completely on Dad's side. She cut off all communication with Nick, blocked him everywhere, and told me she didn't understand how Mom could even consider defending what he did. And I felt the same, completely on Sam and Dad's side because what Nick did was unforgivable. Period. There was no way to justify it or minimize it. Sam was devastated, literally and completely devastated. He stopped going to family dinners because he couldn't be in the same house where he used to go with Heather. He lost like 10 pounds in 2 months because he barely ate. He stopped going out with his friends. He basically became a shadow of who he was before. And I tried to be there for him, but I didn't know what to say. Because what do you say to someone who just lost their fiancée and their brother at the same time? I'd tell him things were going to get better, that eventually the pain would lessen, But even as I said it, I knew it sounded hollow because the truth was, I didn't know if things were going to get better. I didn't know how someone recovers from something like that. Mom kept visiting Nick and Heather, went to their apartment like once a week, and every time she did, Dad would get furious. Tell her she was choosing Nick over Sam, that she was validating what he did by continuing to treat him like nothing had happened. And Mom would cry and say she couldn't just stop being his mother, that she needed to keep the family together somehow. But all she was accomplishing was making the rest of us feel betrayed too. The sickest part of it all was that Nick and Heather got engaged like 4 months after all the drama, like they didn't even wait a decent amount of time. They just decided that since they'd destroyed everything, they could do whatever they wanted. And when Mom told us they were getting married, I thought she was joking. But no, they were really getting married. And they did 6 months later in a small ceremony that only Mom attended. Not even Dad went because he told Mom that if she went to that wedding, he wouldn't be there when she got back. And Mom chose to go anyway. And I remember that day perfectly because Dad was at home alone, watching TV and pretending he didn't care. But you could see on his face that he was broken, that the family he'd built over decades had disintegrated before his eyes and there was nothing he could do about it. Family dinners stopped existing after that, like completely. There were no more Sunday gatherings, no birthday celebrations altogether. Everyone started doing their own thing separately. And it was weird and sad because we'd been so close and now we barely talked. Sam moved to a new apartment on the other side of town because he couldn't stand being near where he'd lived with Heather. Lily got a job in another city like 3 hours away and left because she said she needed to get away from all the family drama. And I stayed trying to be the bridge between everyone, but basically being the messenger of bad news because nobody else wanted to talk to each other directly. Mom kept insisting we all had to forgive Nick. That family was the most important thing. And I'd tell her she was the one who didn't understand, that Nick had violated the most basic principle of family loyalty that she and Dad had taught us our whole lives, that you couldn't preach about blood being thicker than water and then expect everyone to forgive something like that, but she didn't want to listen, just kept saying that someday we'd all regret cutting Nick out of our lives. It went on like that for like 2 years. 2 years of broken family, of Sam trying to rebuild his life, of Lily living in another city and only coming to visit occasionally, of Dad and Mom having a tense relationship because she kept visiting Nick and he hated it, of me trying to maintain some kind of normalcy when clearly there was nothing normal about the situation. And honestly, I thought that's how things were going to be forever, that we were never going to be a real family again, that Nick and Heather were going to live their happy life while the rest of us carried the damage they'd caused. But then, and this is the part that gives me that dark satisfaction I mentioned at the beginning, life decided to give Nick a taste of his own medicine, because turns out Heather cheated on him, the same Heather who'd left Sam for Nick, who'd said she'd fallen in love with Nick and couldn't help it. Turns out she did exactly the same thing with someone else. Mom was the one who told us. She came to Dad's house. They still lived together, but basically as roommates at that point, crying and saying Nick was devastated, that Heather had been having an affair with a coworker for months, and Nick had just found out, that he was completely broken and needed his family. And Dad's first reaction was to laugh, like a bitter, sarcastic laugh. And he told Mom that now Nick knew how Sam felt, that maybe now he understood the pain he'd caused his brother. And Mom was outraged, told us all we had to be better people, that Nick needed us, that it didn't matter what had happened in the past, he was still our brother and we had to support him. I called Lily to tell her, and she basically said Nick was getting exactly what he deserved, that it was pure karma, and that she had no intention of being there for him after how he'd treated Sam, and I agreed. Like part of me felt a little sorry because nobody deserves to be cheated on like that, but the other part, the bigger part, thought it was poetic justice, that Nick was finally experiencing the pain he'd inflicted. Sam didn't say much when he found out. I think he didn't know how to feel about it. He wasn't happy exactly because he's not the type of person who enjoys others suffering. But he wasn't sad for Nick either. It was basically like, meh, and he moved on with his life. Which, to be honest, was probably the best reaction because it showed he'd really gotten over everything and that Nick no longer had any power over him. Mom kept pushing for all of us to go see Nick, said this was an opportunity to heal, for the family to come together again, for all of us to leave the past behind. And when none of us agreed, she got really angry, said we were cruel, that we were destroying the family out of pride, that someday we'd regret it, But the thing is, she didn't understand, couldn't understand, or didn't want to understand. That what Nick did wasn't something you just forgive and forget, that there were consequences for betraying your family that way. And those consequences included that when life gave you what you deserved, you couldn't expect everyone to run to console you. Now it's been like 3 years since all the original drama, and almost a year since Heather cheated on Nick, and things are weird, but somehow more stable than before. Like we've all accepted that this is the new reality of our family. Sam is dating someone new, a girl he met at work who seems really great. I don't know if it'll become something serious, but at least he's happy, and that's what matters. Lily is still in the other city, but we talk more often now. She video calls with Dad and me, and she's considering moving back next year. Dad and Mom are still together, but their relationship never went back to what it was. There's a distance between them that didn't exist before. Mom still sees Nick occasionally, but doesn't mention it to us anymore, because she knows nobody wants to hear about him, and Dad basically lives his life as if Nick never existed. Which is sad, but it's also his way of dealing with everything. Nick and Heather got divorced like 6 months ago, according to what Mom told Dad and he told me, because apparently that's the only way we find out things about Nick now. And Nick is living alone in a small apartment, working at the same job, but I guess without the same energy as before. And part of me wonders if he finally understands what he did, if he's ever really apologized to Sam, or if he just keeps thinking we're all too hard on him. Last week, Sam and I went out for drinks, and he mentioned Nick for the first time, in a long time. Said sometimes he thinks about how things would be if none of that had happened, if Nick and Heather hadn't betrayed his trust, if the family was still together. And I told him there was no point thinking about those what-ifs, that the reality is this, and at least now he's in a better place. And he was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're right." I guess I just wonder if Nick ever regrets it. And honestly, I wonder that too. But in the end, I think it doesn't matter, because the damage is already done and there's no way to undo it, and we all have to live with the consequences of the choices we make. And Nick chose to betray his family, and now he has to live with that, just like we have to live with the broken family he left behind.